I have been playing a lot of Nintendo 64 recently, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I guess nostalgia definitely plays a role with that. The Nintendo 64 came out in 1996, and I remember the first time I ever played a Nintendo 64. It was over at my cousin's house. My uncle had bought one for her and himself to some degree, and she had Super Mario 64 and Wayne Gretzky 3D hockey. And I absolutely fell in love with this system. I was a Sega Genesis owner, so I was used to a certain graphical style. But to see what the N64 was capable of was honestly absolutely mind blowing. I would just stare at the screen, almost in a hypnotic trance, at this 3D world that was crafted for Mario. It was just an amazing experience and something that really sort of revolutionized the 3D platformer genre. I didn't get my Nintendo 64 until spring of 1997, in which I bought the system and a copy of Turok the Dinosaur Hunter. 12-year-old RGT thoroughly enjoyed his Nintendo 64, and I went on to get many other games for it, including wrestling games. I mean, I did write a book on him. But one game that always stuck out in my mind was The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. I remember how I came across this game, of course, in the issues of Nintendo Power that I was subscribed to. One day, I came home from school and there was a package at my front door addressed to me from Nintendo. I was confused. I didn't know what was going on here, but I was very excited for it. I rushed into the house, I ripped open the package, and lo and behold, was The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Collector's Edition for the Nintendo 64. I was thrilled. Nintendo must have rewarded me for being a subscriber to Nintendo Power. I immediately called my mom up at work and she was like, "You're an idiot." And I was like, "What? What's the problem?" And she was like, "I bought that for you. You weren't supposed to open it." And I was like, "Well, I've already opened it, so can I keep it?" And she, of course, said yes. The Legend of Zelda franchise is a long and storied franchise, and of course, there's been games for it before Ocarina of Time, and of course, after. And when you look at what the best Zelda game is, it's truly a very subjective thing. I know recently I've kind of leaned more towards Breath of the Wild when it comes to what I want from a Legend of Zelda game, but I decided to play through The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time on a Nintendo 64 for the first time in a very, very long time. So I kind of want to talk about this game and kind of tell you guys why I'm kind of back on board with this being the best Legend of Zelda game ever and maybe the greatest game ever. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time released on the Nintendo 64 in 1998. And honestly, it was almost more than just a simple video game because when you look at the Nintendo 64 as a system, it kind of had a little bit of an issue. Whereas other companies had moved into the CD-ROM based medium for their physical media, which allowed for bigger game file sizes and, of course, adding in load times into games, Nintendo with the Nintendo 64 stuck with cartridges. Now, this was good from some aspects because you had no loading times. But of course, there were some drawbacks to it, and the cartridges themselves were a bit more expensive. Because of all of this, you had a situation where many third parties weren't exactly rushing to put their games onto the Nintendo 64, unlike the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn. Many people were heavily waiting for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time to be sort of a savior for the Nintendo 64. There was previews in magazines. Everyone was buzzing with hype about it. And was it going to be a game that actually lived up to the hype, lived up to the standards? And I think it really did. I honestly think it really did. So one of the big things about The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was, of course, the jump from the 2D genre to the 3D genre. Now, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is a lot of people's favorite Legend of Zelda game. I am someone who does not have nostalgia for that game, so I viewed it from playing it as an adult. I never owned a Super Nintendo as a kid, and I definitely really enjoy A Link to the Past. I think it is a phenomenal game. But when you kind of compare it to Ocarina of Time, I feel like Ocarina of Time takes the Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past formula and puts it in a 3D world and makes it bigger and badder to me. It is an immersive experience, an open world that really felt alive. There was so much wonder and mystery when you first start to enter Hyrule Field and look around for the first time, and you're like, wow, I have all this freedom. I have all this space. Console games at the time weren't really known for these open-ended experiences where you could go wherever and do whatever. And The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time really sort of expanded upon that. A Link to the Past, while great, was definitely a bit more of a linear experience. You had to do things in a certain order, and your path was a bit more predetermined, whereas you had a little bit more freedom in Ocarina of Time. But beyond just how the world was crafted, there were so many gameplay innovations added into Ocarina of Time. The introduction of Z-targeting. It was a new way that players could interact with enemies in a 3D space because there was no sort of guideline to how to do this. It was essentially your first lock-on system in a 3D game that would allow you to target an enemy and focus solely on them. You could also then cycle through enemies by hitting the Z trigger on the Nintendo 64, which really made for just an awesome experience. It really made for gameplay that I still feel like holds up today. Of course, you had a dynamic camera and controls, which I do feel a little bit dated by modern standards, but this was the gold standard for how movement and combat should have worked in 3D games. You have to remember, this was not a copycat game. This was a pioneer game. The game that sort of set a standard for how things should be, and you should build upon this standard. Of course, you had the seamlessness of the entire overworld. Whether you wanted to go to Kokiri Forest to Death Mountain, everything was just interconnected. And all of these interconnected areas felt very expansive and felt very real. I think Ocarina of Time didn't just succeed in transitioning to 3D. It sort of set the standard. It became the torchbearer of how 3D adventure games should be designed. And so many games that came out after it have a lot to thank Nintendo for creating this and essentially giving them the blueprint of how these games should be made. One of the biggest areas that I feel like modern Legend of Zelda games can feel like a bit of a letdown in terms of it being more of an afterthought than a focus is the story aspect of the game. And while I do think Tears of the Kingdom did have a slightly better story than Breath of the Wild, both of those games kind of left a lot to be desired. Now, that's sort of by design because of the free-flowing nature of that game. You kind of craft your own story. But as far as fundamental things within the world, they're a bit few and far between. I think Ocarina of Time arguably has one of the best stories of a Zelda game because of just how dynamic it is. You have so many different things happening and so many things are uncovered throughout playing the game and sitting through some cutscenes of the game, and it's really a timeless tale on the surface level of evil, destiny, courage, and it feels very personal as the game goes along. Of course, there are fundamental reasons for that sort of mindset with this. One of the main things is the fact that you end up switching between young and adult Link, and it just made for an awesome thing because it really showed you two different worlds crafted in the same world. 7 years is a very long time. If you sit back and look at your life and think of where you were 7 years ago, you're probably in a different sort of state, whether it's a different mental state, a different financial state, or just living in a different place. A lot can change in 7 years, and I feel like the world of Hyrule in Ocarina of Time really sort of reflects that. It reflects the changes that can occur. seeing, of course, towns be burned to the ground and things happening and evil taking over things as an adult. Whereas a child, you have more of a simplistic look on the world. You don't notice all of the negative things that you notice when you're an adult. Now, maybe I'm looking too deep into that, but I feel like that's some of the imagery that is presented in this game. And it's trying to tell you that as you get older, you do see things differently. I think it's something that's kind of understated in the game, but I definitely noticed it as I was playing it. Of course, you have all the iconic characters, from the random townsfolk to Zelda to Ganondorf, who is one of the most evil main characters of all time. And then you have Navi. Now, Navi is a bit of a controversial topic. Honestly, she doesn't annoy me that much, but the "hey, listen" can sort of become a little bit annoying after things, we've been playing the game for a while and you just don't want to hear her voice, but she always has something to say and something to add to the conversation. But like I said, just seeing Castletown go from a bright, vibrant place full of shops and happy people to a desolate, destroyed area was just really interesting. It was such an interesting dynamic, and it kind of shows you that playing Ocarina of Time as a child and playing Ocarina of Time as an adult kind of has that same sort of feeling that you get when Link goes from young Link to young adult Link. And I think one thing that really hones in on that is just how truly dark this story is, and some of the twists and turns that might be lost on someone when they are playing the game as a younger person. One thing that definitely sticks out in my mind has to be the Shadow Temple, which is essentially a place that you aren't supposed to see. Nobody was supposed to see this, because within the Shadow Temple, this holds the biggest atrocities of Hyrulean history. How people were taken down to this Shadow Temple, tortured, left for dead. There's one area that is just strikingly horrifying, which has two sort of pieces of wood that are crossed over, not in a cross, more of in an X format, and underneath it is a large, hideous puddle of blood. Some of the townsfolk that you talk to are miserable people who just have nothing to look forward to and filled with horrible feelings, and you don't realize this until you are kind of an adult, to where it sort of starts to weigh on you, and it starts to make you think about this story almost in a completely different light, because it's not all just happiness here. Obviously, becoming adult Link, you start to go down the path of seeing the world for how it truly is. But then you start to realize that even as seeing the world as it truly is, there are still hidden secrets. There are still things that are unmentionable, that if you were to discover them, you would be absolutely horrified. And I think that that really plays a role in this. And the Shadow Temple just leaves such an impression upon you about how things are actually done within the world, the atrocities that we try to sweep under the rug that nobody will ever hear about. I absolutely love the story of this game because it's impactful on many different levels. There's the surface level, good versus evil, but then there's the caveats, the sort of things that slip in between the cracks that really give it just a total, vision of how life kind of is. And like I said, maybe I am looking too deep into this, but it's striking how much you notice it playing through the game as an adult than you do playing through the game as a kid. And it's something that's definitely understated, just how dark this story gets. I feel like it's understated completely when people talk about Ocarina of Time, and it's a shame because I would put this story right up alongside of anyone's favorite Legend of Zelda game because of the fact that it just has so many twists and turns and different things that kind of make you question whether this is actually right or not, whether this is good or evil. It's kind of left up for you to decide. Of course, though, we have to talk about the gameplay of this game because The gameplay of Ocarina of Time is honestly just like a masterclass in both design, blending exploration, combat, and puzzle solving. Things that, you know, usually weren't put together in this time frame back in 1998 because there's a lot of different moving parts to it. But Nintendo absolutely knocked it out of the park and once again kind of set a standard as far as how a game in this style should be done. You, of course, have the dungeons of the game, which are some of the most fun dungeons in a Legend of Zelda game. You have the eerie forest temple to the mind-bending water temple. Each dungeon is very unique and has a memorable challenge to it. And honestly, I think most of the dungeons are pretty fair in their difficulty. There may be some instances where you kind of get stumped, but if you really think your way through it, which this game encourages you to do, kind of expand your mind a little bit, you'll start to see that it all kind of makes sense. Now, yes, there are some more difficult dungeons than other dungeons, and you will probably have some sort of cheap deaths along the way. But honestly, that's part of the fun of the game, is trying to figure out things on your own and trying to figure out what you did wrong or what you did right to get up until that point. Of course, the gameplay is also ever expanding as you constantly get new essential items that you use that expand not only your inventory, but how you traverse throughout the world or play the game in general. You have the hook shot, you have the bow, you have different types of arrows for the bow, you have a boomerang as a youth. There's all sorts of fun stuff, and of course, you have to talk about the ocarina. Now, I'll talk more about the ocarina as we go on in this video, talking about more of the music of it, but the ocarina does play a huge role in the gameplay. You have boss battles. All of the boss battles, I think, are expertly crafted. Each boss battle is a puzzle in and of itself, trying to figure out weak points of the bosses. And some bosses are more difficult than others, but honestly, I feel like all of the bosses are easy enough to where, yeah, you might die once or twice, but then you'll kind of figure out the do's and don'ts of how you defeat them, and it becomes very satisfying. There's strategy, there's timing, and figuring out the right tools to use against a certain boss really has a very satisfying outcome once you finally get everything down. But of course, there is just the world of Hyrule itself, because there's so many hidden things within it that you just want to explore every nook and cranny, from discovering random fairies who can give you magic abilities, to discovering little holes in the ground where you could find some additional rupees, trying to figure out how to get heart pieces to expand your life bar. It's just so much fun to see something and try to figure out how you get there, how you get that. There's also mini games that you come across in the game with some of the townsfolk and the shopkeeps. There's different side missions that you can do within the game as well that they don't play a role in the main story or in your main quest, but it definitely makes the world itself feel more alive. People need help. People need you to help them, and you can choose to help them and get rewarded for it, or you could simply go on your own path and wish the best for them. I really like just how many different things there are within the game, and once again, going back to the time frame when this released, it was an absolutely outstanding experience, something that you didn't really see all that much, especially in a 3D game. The game wanted you to explore Hyrule, and it rewarded you for exploring the world of Hyrule, and I think that just makes for a very timeless experience. Of course, when talking about The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, you have to talk about something right in the title of the game: the ocarina and the music of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. In 1998, nobody knew what an ocarina was, but after this game came out, everyone wanted to pick up one of these. Everyone wanted to have an ocarina to play the songs that were in the game. Koji Kondo's score for Ocarina of Time is honestly nothing short of legendary. The music doesn't just accompany the game as something to be heard. It tells the story, it helps build the world, and really stirs up different emotions in you. melody from Epona's song to the Song of Time serves a purpose. It serves something within the game. The songs are there to assist you on your journey, to summon Epona, to be able to quickly go to a temple if you want to do that, or to go back to the Temple of Time. There are so many things that these songs actually do that it really brought music kind of to the forefront of the game, because the musical aspect of it was just so important as well. The music helps elevate just every scene that you have within the game, from, tender moments with Zelda to crazy boss battles. And I think there's a depth to the music as well as you are playing this game, because of the fact that so many of these songs are just very memorable for potentially different reasons. Whether you want to do a little dance or you want to relax or something like that, these songs stick with you. And you're not going to the menu constantly to see what sort of button presses you need to do in order to play the ocarina. It comes naturally to you. You're just hearing it and you're understanding what you need to do and how the buttons are that you need to press. I think Ocarina of Time kind of set the standard for Legend of Zelda music, because Link to the Past was great, but you hear more often than not Ocarina of Time songs kind of being remixed and reintroduced to games, more so than you do with A Link to the Past. That's not a knock against the game or anything like that. It's just kind of how it is, because the music was so important to this game from the perspective of a gameplay design by having the ocarina. And with all that being said, you have to just look at what The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time did, not just for Zelda, not just for Nintendo, not just for the Nintendo 64, but honestly, for the entire video game industry. Because I really feel like its influence can be seen in so many games that have come out since Ocarina of Time. Whether you're talking about things like the influence on game design, how this sort of showed you a blueprint of how an open world exploration should be done, along with something like cinematic storytelling, along with the intuitive control system, the targeting that you have within this game, the multiple different things that you can acquire throughout playing this game. It's just something that I feel like set a standard for how these games and how video games could kind of have been viewed, because this didn't feel just like another video game. This felt like a huge leap. This felt like something that you were experiencing that was monumental, that was going to take video games in an upper echelon, in a further dimension than we had ever really seen before. It's something that's become a beloved piece of gaming history. How many top 10 lists do you see? How many greatest games lists of all times do you see that Ocarina of Time still manages to be on top of? Hell, it's the highest rated game still to this day on a place like Metacritic, which has a lot of different video games that have been released since then. And I just feel like it has a legacy attached to it. It's a game that, the controls might be a little bit wonky if you've never held an N64 controller before, but once you kind of get into it, once you start to understand the mechanics of it, I feel like it just becomes second nature. You don't have to overthink things. You're overthinking the puzzles. You're overthinking how to advance. You're not overthinking the actual control that you have over Link. You're not overthinking the world itself and how to traverse it. It becomes like second nature to a lot of people. And I just feel like, whether you pick this up for the first time in 1998 or at the time of the filming of this video, 2024, I just feel like this game holds up extremely well. And I didn't know how I was going to feel playing through the game again for the first time in a very long time. And there were many things that I had, kind of forgotten, kind of, misremembered, and kind of got stuck here and there. It took me a couple days to play through it. I would beat a temple or two at a time, a dungeon or two at a time, and then, kind of reset and, figure out what I wanted to do next. But I thoroughly enjoyed my time with this game. And I really don't think that this gameplay that I did, this playthrough of the game, was enjoyed because of nostalgia. Was enjoyed because of trying to relive the era when I was 13 years old playing this game. I think I really enjoyed this game and playing through this game again because it's just that damn good. The dungeon design, the world itself, the characters you come across, the quests that you have to go on, the sense of wonder, the sense of freedom, it still holds up to this day. It still feels very fresh in an era where games have come and gone that have, paid homage to this game. There's a reason why this game stands the test of time. And I don't necessarily think it's because of nostalgia. I think it's just because Nintendo hit a home run with this game. From top to bottom, everything about it is just so high quality. And it signifies an era of video games where we were still exploring. We were still trying to figure out what the next